All right, so my name is Bill Green. I'm the director of the MIT Energy Initiative. I want to thank you all for coming to our first seminar of the semester. The MIT Energy Initiative sponsors this speaker series to try to help the people on campus keep informed about what's happening to try to decarbonize our energy system, and also to help people recognize the urgency of motion to try to make change happen. And we have a speaker today that's going to talk about some pretty urgent work going on to try to make change happen here in Massachusetts. The MIT Energy Initiative is the hub of energy research at MIT, and one of its roles is to bring leaders of industry, government, nonprofits, and academia to come to campus to talk to the community and also to participate in workshops and research projects and conferences with the people actively working on the energy transition here. The global energy system is, of course, super complicated. It's complicated today with today's fossil fuel system. It's going to be complicated in the future with the coming clean energy system. And there's many, many different parts. And today we're going to hear about one really important part that's particularly important for Massachusetts is offshore wind. So different parts of the world have different resources and different situations. And one resource we've got plenty of here is wind. And particularly in the south coast of Massachusetts, it's really windy, and it's really fantastic for providing clean energy here. The entire energy system is, of course, extremely complicated, as I said, and one part of it is providing electricity, and that's what we're going to hear about today. But today we use fossil fuels for many, many, many things, not just to make electricity. And so many people on campus are doing research on all sorts of other parts of the energy system because we have to really change everything. And so the scientists and engineers here have a really big role to play to help develop the technologies that will become the real industries of the future. Today we're going to hear about sort of industry of the present, I guess. It's like the time is now to put in the windmills, and we'll hear about that. But we have many other technologies that are under development here at MIT or from startups or technology that's spun out of MIT that's going to help to change other sectors of the economy and clean up the other sectors. But here in Massachusetts, offshore wind is a really big story. So the legislature has decided that that's really the biggest future contributor to clean energy in the state, and has passed some special laws to try to help that along. And in response to that, a lot of companies, including Vineyard Offshore, which we're going to hear about today, are working to try to actually make that real, get the windmills out there, get the wires connected, get the electrons flowing to power MIT, to power Boston, to power the whole state. Today's speaker is Alicia Barton. She's the CEO of Vineyard Offshore, which is currently involved in offshore wind projects here in New England and also in California, and I think maybe off New York.
Yep.
As well. Before Alicia took her present position leading Vineyard Offshore, she worked in other parts of the clean energy sphere. She was previously the CEO of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and she was president and CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And even more recently, she was CEO of First Light Power, which is a New England-based clean energy producer and storage company. As CEO, Alicia is responsible for developing Vineyard Offshore's portfolio of 6 gigawatts of offshore wind projects, which currently includes a site 15 miles south of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, and a second site proposed for 29 miles off the shore of Nantucket, and also another proposed site off the shore of Long Island, and then a different site off the shore of California. During the presentation, You can submit questions that we'll ask the speaker after the talk. You can submit them electronically using the QR code. Is it on the screen? Not yet. It will be on the screen. Or else you can just type the letters poll, capital POLLEV.com/MITEI, MITEI. And then you go to that link and you'll be able to submit questions for the Q&A. So please join me now in gratefully welcoming Alicia Barton.
Thank you. And I'm going to grab this clicker. Okay, maybe I'll stand here to start, and then we'll go there for Q&A. Is that what you want to do? Okay. Great. So, well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So nice to see people here interested to talk about offshore wind, which certainly is an incredibly important topic to the energy future of Massachusetts and certainly well beyond. I really appreciate that generous introduction, Bill. Thank you also for inviting me to be here to talk about this topic. I'm going to fast forward here. You did a great job highlighting our portfolio, and I have a map which maybe will make it a little bit easier for folks to digest. And so again, just a little bit about Vineyard Offshore. Maybe Bill didn't mention, but so we're 100% owned by Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which is a private equity fund based in Copenhagen, as the name implies. That is actually the largest private equity fund that's solely dedicated to greenfield renewable energy development. It's about 10 years old. Offshore wind is a core part of their business, and we serve as the U.S. offshore wind development arm, the U.S. being one of their larger global markets, but they have projects all over Europe and Asia and truly all over the world in offshore wind, as well as other clean energy infrastructure. So our portfolio, as Bill was outlining, includes the Vineyard Wind 1 project, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And that's a project that's under construction, which is an incredibly exciting milestone to be able to say, finally, after many years of many people working very hard to see that day come to New England. And then we have the site further offshore, which we have proposed as our Vineyard Wind 2 project, which was recently awarded a new contract from Massachusetts, and I can talk a little bit more about that. We have our Excelsior Wind project, which is off the coast of New York and New Jersey, and plan to interconnect onto Long Island. So helping, in that case, New York meet its very aggressive clean energy and offshore wind specific targets. And then we have this project in California, and that's up on the northern coast of California. It's maybe a little bit hard to tell from this map, but it's actually pretty close up there near the Oregon border. And that is a project that, unlike the other ones on the East Coast, will be a deployment of floating offshore wind technology. So on the East Coast, we're talking about all fixed bottom offshore wind. I'm going to assume if you came to this lecture, you know generally what offshore wind is. You know that there's a lot that's been deployed in Europe and globally, and not very much that's been deployed here. And that's kind of the story that I wanted to start by telling, and then I really would prefer to spend more time, in conversation with you, Bill, and taking audience questions. But I think, sort of thinking about the topic of the talk and finding a new era of success, the way I was thinking about this story is really to zoom out from, necessarily our projects and kind of talk about the arc of offshore wind in the U.S. and, where we are today, what's hard and what's been challenging and where we're struggling, and then also where we're succeeding. And I do think there's actually a lot of exciting things that are going to happen in the not too distant future. I didn't bring any other substantive slides. I just brought some nice pictures of our projects. I love these pictures, so just indulge me in sharing them. And I'm not going to, share all the captions or anything, but these are real-world pictures of the Vineyard Wind project. So Vineyard Wind is 800 megawatts, and as I said, is in the midst of construction. Some of you probably also read that we did have a construction accident over the summer with a blade that broke. I can talk more about that. But generally speaking, I would say prior to the blade incident getting a lot of attention, really known for being the first large-scale offshore wind project in the U.S. to move forward to construction. And, it really has been a long time coming. So, thinking about, again, that arc of offshore wind progress in the U.S., I was thinking about it in my own personal history working on offshore wind, which goes back 15 years, which for the U.S. is quite a long time. 15 years ago, there weren't that many people working on offshore wind. There weren't that many people talking about it, but Massachusetts was. And so, I was thinking about this in kind of a few chapters. And the first chapter, I would say, was, really Massachusetts' initial efforts to launch offshore wind, which were centered on a prior project called Cape Wind, which some of you may recall. It was extremely well-known and extremely controversial, had significant political opposition and local opposition on Cape Cod, including from significant political figures like Ted Kennedy amongst others, as well as opposition from well-known people like the Koch brothers and the like. And that there literally have been many books and movies written about that project, so you guys can check that out if you want to dig a bit deeper. But what Massachusetts was doing at the time was really placing a bet that, like, if we could get one project launched, then the rest of the projects would follow. And that was a strategy. It was a purposeful strategy of saying, like, we just need to get one. We need to show this is real, and then things will take off. And so I won't belabor all the details, but the utilities in the state were essentially kind of coerced or encouraged to enter into long-term contracts with that project to make it financeable. More significantly, I think, as we sit here today, the state made a very long-term effort, sort of took the long view and made a significant investment in the first offshore wind port facility in the U.S. So this is in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but back then, when I was CEO of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, we, on behalf of the Commonwealth, took state bond funding and invested, at the time, $130 million into a port in New Bedford to renovate it to be the first purpose-built offshore wind facility in the U.S. The offshore wind requires very, very specialized capabilities, including heavy loads for the cranes and the size and scale of the components that we're talking about. So that project, just to place it in context, so this first chapter, I'm talking about Cape Wind, this is like, think of it as like 2007 to 2015 or so. We finished the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal construction in January of 2015. Cape Wind failed and canceled its project in January of 2015 as well. And so that was, a very painful episode and an extremely clear to some of us that were there, growing pain of the industry. And one that at the time many people said, that will there be offshore wind in the U.S.? We tried. We had this strategy. We were going to build a project. That project failed. Has the whole strategy failed? And I think that was an open question for some time. But then we entered, what was the second chapter, and it really was, I think a lot of work amongst policymakers, stakeholders, to think about, okay, that this isn't really just about one project. This is about our climate targets. This is about the fact that this is a mature technology in Europe. This is about jobs that can be created, and that started to catch on. So when I was the CEO of Mass CEC from 2012 through the end of 2015, it was a very lonely conversation when I would talk to my peers in other states. And I would go to New York, for example, and say, you guys should really think about offshore wind. And they're kind of like, yeah, I think we'll watch how it goes for you guys first. And think about that a little bit later. But then in that next phase, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill in 2016, and now I'm thinking about basically 2016 through 2020 as this next chapter, passed the first bill that set up a procurement. So this was a different strategy. We're going to have competition. We're going to invite multiple parties to bid. We're going to, see what the prices are, see if we can imagine this power being affordable. That was a big concern at the time, and run that playbook. And as they started doing that, some other states started paying attention as well. New York called me back and said, okay, we want to do offshore wind. Would you want to come over here and work on it? And that's when I went to take the job at NYSERDA, leading New York's climate efforts. A lot of exciting things happened. I mentioned Massachusetts passing that legislation that set up the procurement. That was the procurement that led to the Vineyard Wind project. So that was a PPA that was awarded back in 2017. So again, just keeping the time horizons in mind, Vineyard Wind would ultimately start using the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal in 2023, so 8 years after we finished the construction. So we were definitely early on that, and another 7 years even after, 6 years after the initial procurement to give them the contract to get going. But New York passed a landmark climate law that I'm extremely proud of to require the state to fully decarbonize its grid. We were picking up momentum in this time, and it wasn't just Massachusetts and New York. It's the other New England states had started issuing contracts as well, down into Maryland and Virginia, and we started to see momentum. But real progress was still a little bit elusive in this 2016 to 2020 time period, and it may be intuitive, but that also coincides with the first presidency of Donald Trump, who is not a fan of offshore wind, as presumably many of you are aware. So we had the states moving forward, but we lacked a partner at the federal government that was really going to help us get there. And I was trying to get new leases issued off the coast of New York in my role on behalf of the state of New York, and we were frankly running into brick walls there. Vineyard Wind had its power contract now. Massachusetts came up with this new policy. They competed, they won, and yet still they couldn't get their permits out of the federal government. And so, some of you may remember during that time, towards the end of the Trump presidency, they really had to withdraw their permits essentially and undertake a fairly risky strategy to try and bet on a future administration. And so we then went into what was definitely the most exciting time we've had for offshore wind in the U.S. So when President Biden takes office in 2021, he issues the New York Bight leases. He starts issuing permits, including, very soon after taking office, the permit for Vineyard Wind to allow the project to go forward. And so in 2021, 2022, and starting into 2023, all these things were happening. We started to get a massive number of projects contracted for power with states up and down the East Coast. We started to see the federal government issuing new leases, record prices. The New York Bight lease, the one that I had, tried to extract from the Trump administration on behalf of New York, ultimately, cleared many billions of dollars in revenue when they ran the lease sale, and it was more than any offshore oil and gas leasing effort previous in history. So that was incredibly exciting and validating for the fact that not only, again, is this a climate initiative, but we know that there's real capital that's ready to work to do this. And then, amidst all these positive things happening, including Vineyard Wind finally getting to financial close, which is a critical milestone to allow projects to move forward and start construction, we ran into the story that everybody knows around interest rates, inflation, global supply chain crunch, and again started to hit more of a down cycle for sure. And it's that really, kind of came to a head in 2023, and then here into 2024, we saw projects canceling their PPAs with states. They were saying, essentially, we contracted this previously at prices that we can no longer deliver on. When we go to the supply chain, it's extremely crowded globally, and one thing people should keep in mind is that we're a new market here in the U.S. and we're competing against projects in a global marketplace. So when we want to place an order for turbines or high voltage electrical equipment, we are competing against projects all over the world, and the U.S. candidly is viewed as a risky market. We're newer. We don't have a significant track record. We have, unfortunately, ongoing political risk with change in administration risk. So those things tend to drive up the cost as well. So we saw a lot of contracts canceled. We also saw, and this has been super unfortunate, I think, a number of commitments for supply chain manufacturing, domestic manufacturing in the U.S., backtrack away from. That's been one of the policy goals of advocates of offshore wind, has been to set up a domestic supply chain to create the jobs, not only in construction, but manufacturing jobs as well. And there's strong, long-term rationale for that. The components that we're talking about are so massive, it really does make sense to manufacture them close to where they will be deployed rather than shipping them all over the world on highly specialized vessels that are extremely scarce. But we saw, for example, in New York, for my company, we'd contracted with GE to build a next generation turbine, and they were going to do manufacturing for blades and the cells of the wind turbines in upstate New York. And decided that they couldn't make that work and had to cancel those plans, which led to further power contract cancellations, including our project. And so it you know, I think, you know, to me, it's a very clear story of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Like every time we're making progress, we've, you know, found a new growing pain for an early industry, found, you know, additional challenges that maybe sometimes could have been foreseen, maybe they couldn't. One of those challenges, and I touched on this already, was also, you know, as the first large project to go to construction, we did have a construction accident this summer where we had one of the blades on a single turbine fail catastrophically and break and shed debris into the water. This is not something that's super common in the global offshore wind industry. It has been pretty common in onshore wind. There are quite a lot of blades that break historically. But when that happens on land, the sort of the debris lands and settles in a certain spot rather than being carried to many places, which is what occurred with us over the summer, where we had debris washing up on the shores of Nantucket and Cape Cod, particularly. I think that incident has gotten what I would say is maybe a bit outsized attention everywhere I go, but of course, you know, people know what I do for a living. You know, it comes up a lot. I want to sort of put the impacts of that incident in context. I think it's important because I do think the media has been a bit misleading on this at times. So there were no injuries. There was no private property damage. Our blade was damaged, but no private property, no vessels, no docks, nothing like that. We have no evidence of any species being injured or, you know, again, sort of killed or, you know, anything like that you see. We did have 1 day of beach closures on part of Nantucket in an abundance of caution, but they were reopened the next morning. And we've been hard at work with debris recovery ever since. So again, when you put that in context of the environmental damage, I think from, frankly, any fossil fuel plant that is constantly emitting, well, you know what fossil fuel plants emit, let alone oil spills and the like. I think it's important to just, you know, keep this relativity in context. But at the same time, we're new here, right? We're the new industry and all eyes are on us. And undoubtedly, this was a setback and a learning experience that hopefully will make the industry stronger and that we will learn from as we go to this next chapter. Now, this is the part that I'm really excited to share, I think, and it's easy to lose track of it. So again, you kind of, I think, hear about offshore wind, you hear, oh, okay, Vineyard Wind's going to construction, that's great. All these contracts are getting canceled over here. That doesn't sound so great. Like what's really happening? If you look at the pipeline of offshore wind projects in the U.S., this next chapter is going to start in 2025, which of course coincidentally coincides with the start of a new presidential administration, and we don't know which administration that will be. But whichever administration it is, we have essentially 8,000 megawatts or 8 gigawatts of projects that have their federal permits, have power contracts, and are reaching financial close and going to construction. So next year, in the first term of either Trump or Harris, whoever ends up taking the White House, we will have 8,000 megawatts of offshore wind under construction in this country, which is just, you know, an extraordinary maturation and finally catching up to, you know, where we've hoped to be all of these years. And it's sort of a, you know, there's a weight to that as an industry that is very, very different than what we've confronted in the past. And so I get, you know, a lot of questions about, you know, what happens if Trump gets elected? Does that mean offshore wind will never happen in the U.S.? And, you know, I would say absolutely not. And again, we're going to have 8,000 megawatts under construction, which is extremely sizable. I mean, that's enough power for 4 million homes, just to give you a sense of it. I think it'll be, you know, hard for anyone to want to slow down or curtail jobs that are, you know, actively going for, you know, folks in the construction industry. The Vineyard Wind project, some great statistics, you know, we've already created just on our one 800 megawatt project, so again about, you know, 10% of what I'm talking about for next year, 1,200 union jobs, and closer to 5,000 total jobs in terms of the construction of that project. And we do rigorous tracking of the jobs because it's a really important part of the validation of, you know, why states are investing in this technology and supporting it. So I think that's a game changer. I don't mean to suggest that it doesn't matter, though, and I think, if you look at, again, that sort of arc in the story that I'm telling, having committed public policy that makes long-term investments is really critical, and that's been part of what's been successful. Massachusetts investing in New Bedford over a decade ago, but realizing the benefits of that now where, for example, we have multiple other offshore wind ports that are now being constructed or under construction and soon to be completed in Massachusetts to support the offshore wind industry. So we made the first investment and others have followed. And again, you see that up and down the East Coast, and I can go into specifics for other states if it's helpful. And so, I think with, a supportive federal administration and supportive states, and we aren't seeing states really slow down. Part of the reason I think they're not slowing down on offshore wind is that there aren't a lot of good alternatives to decarbonize dense load centers on the East Coast of the United States. I think we could talk about, possibilities, but the way I look at it and have spent a lot of time looking at it over the years, I do think offshore wind is absolutely needed in order for us to be able to get to a clean electricity grid, from New England down through the mid-Atlantic for sure. So there's a lot to be positive about, even despite the challenges that we continue to navigate. And I'm really excited to see so many people paying attention to the industry. It's a joy to try and paint a picture of what's really happening for people, sharing pictures like these that are reality. Maybe some of you have driven by New Bedford and you've seen these things. I mean, they're massive. The other one is if you take the Acela between New York and Boston, you see the New London Pier, and they have offshore wind turbine components there in and out, and it's really fun to see. I'm like, when I'm on the Acela with my kid, I'm like pressing my face up against the glass and everybody's like, what the heck are they looking at? But it's, these are tangible signs that we are actually taking steps to decarbonize the electric grid for the future. It's not happening fast enough. And we have definitely had setbacks along the way, but we're starting to put the pieces together. And I have a lot of thoughts about how we can make this next chapter the one where we do things faster and don't have so many of the same challenges that we've had. But I think, I'll leave it there and maybe get into the discussion.
All right, great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So we're going to sit in the front here and do a little chat. And please email in, use the, I don't know where the,
oh, yeah,
we got the QR code up there to show the how to do it for
yeah. I think it was back here, right?
There we go.
Yeah.
Look at that. So you can send questions in that way. Yeah. So thank you again for the nice talk and for your hard work over many years in many roles, all culminating to this important project. Maybe you can comment. What do you think in the long term? What are the most important ways the energy markets have to change to support these kind of large-scale deployments of offshore wind and other large projects like this?
Yeah, I mean, the energy market question is one that I think we've gotten hung up on quite a bit over the years, and it's not an easy one to solve. So, again, the states that we're talking about primarily, and I hope I don't go too far into the weeds, but are in what we consider deregulated electricity markets, where you have essentially, wholesale markets really premised on competition and, sort of by and large kind of merchant power sales that rely on those markets to function. And then here comes offshore wind along with some other renewables and says, well, that doesn't really work for us. We need certainty. We need a 20-year contract, a 30-year contract. And the states have gone along with that, which has, teed up a bit of a collision between competitive wholesale electricity markets and long-term contracting. I think, as I said, I think to some degree, I think we've maybe over-worried about that, and we'll see, whether that turns out to be right or wrong. But essentially, right now, we're in such a cyclical upturn in the need for power that having multiple avenues to do that, including the existing wholesale energy markets plus new contracting efforts seems to make sense. There's been quite a lot of discussion about carbon pricing in those wholesale electricity markets, and that is something that the New England ISO has studied extensively, New York ISO has studied extensively. It is a good idea and could work, and it has zero political support and essentially no chance of happening anytime soon. So, I think people aren't wrong to point out the benefits of carbon pricing. It would be there, but we're not in a political moment right now where we can afford to wait for something like that to come along. And so, our pitch to the states is, to continue to put in place the contract structures that will allow projects to move forward. We have lots of specific ideas about how those contracts should be structured. I think, interestingly, one of the things that you hear increasingly from the ISO, who's in charge of grid reliability here in New England, is that we hear a lot about winter reliability and gas pipeline constraints because we're at the end of the pipeline, and in the winter gas supply gets taken up for heating, and then there's not enough for electricity. But the biggest thing we can do to shore up winter reliability is to build as much offshore wind as we can. ISO New England's been pretty increasingly clear about that in recent years, which is extremely helpful. So, you have to think about it from the multiple angles of reliability, affordability, and also decarbonization, which, under the current construct, those wholesale markets aren't really legally allowed to take cognizance of. So we're in a bit of an imperfect situation, I would say, with the contracts maybe not fitting neatly in the competitive wholesale market structure, but I think on balance, that's kind of where we need to be.
Maybe just two follow-ups about that. So one is, it seems like the offshore wind is maybe analogous to nuclear, that it needs gigantic amount of capital up front, and therefore some special arrangement in the market. It's not the same as a little merchant gas turbine coming in. But then I'm wondering why you think the carbon pricing would be so impossible. The state legislature was able to intervene to set up a market that's going to make it possible for the wind to come in. You think they could also intervene and do whatever they wanted with the carbon pricing?
Yeah, again, I think it's one that kind of perplexes people at an intellectual level because there's a lot of rationale for those arguments. And again, you have credible neutral entities like ISO New England or New York ISO making those arguments and saying like this would be a good way to do this. But what we've seen, and it's been in New England states and New York and down in New Jersey as well, to your point about nuclear, is some of those plants needing to get state contracts in order to keep operating. In many cases, those contracts have been justified on the basis of retaining jobs, frankly, which tend to be a little bit more politically motivating than sort of more esoteric discussions about the needs of the electric grid. At least that's been somewhat my experience. I can't say for sure exactly why, carbon pricing hasn't taken off. I'm sure we all have our own theories about it. But, for example, I know when I was working in New York for the governor's office there, they looked at, for example, carbon pricing ballot initiatives in other states, including Washington State. Maybe some of you have followed, had, I think, 3 different times taken a carbon pricing ballot initiative to voters and failed every time. It's just really considered politically unpopular. It's like a gas tax or something like that.
I was thinking not for general carbon tax, just in electricity. It seems like the consumers apparently aren't aware of what controls electricity prices, so just put the carbon tax in there just as a way to... Yeah.
I think that, at the end of the day, the governors have to get comfortable with that, and I think that's been a hard sell.
Just changing topics, what are some of the important research areas that you think that MIT and the engineers here should be working on?
Oh, great. Yes, and I meant to say at the beginning, I'm always so nervous to speak to an audience like this because I am not a scientist, I'm not a technologist, and I can't answer very detailed questions about offshore wind technology. I'm definitely more on the business, commercial, and policy side of things. But we do support, and in my prior roles, and in fact, I was just talking to DOE yesterday or something about what is most impactful to industry in terms of R&D funding and what are the challenges that we need. And there are a bunch. It's an extremely long list. I would say, for example, going back to the Vineyard Offshore portfolio, looking at California and West Coast markets, floating technology is a place where a lot of R&D is still really needed. That's a newer technology globally, where again, fixed bottom, more traditional offshore wind has been deployed. There's 40 gigawatts built in China, 20 in the EU, another 15 in the UK. I mean, like massive numbers, lots of projects. Whereas floating is still, we're talking about a handful of projects and a small number of megawatts. So in order for that technology to catch up, and that's everything from constructability of the floating platforms, how do you get manufacturing and port infrastructure that can actually handle those types of logistics, what's the anchoring technology at various water depths. Truly you could go on and on and on, and it is a big focus of DOE to continue to advance floating technology, which will be helpful to that next generation globally. But even for our projects on the East Coast, there's interesting R&D happening around how vessels, frankly, do their work in a market like the U.S., where we're a bit constrained due to the Jones Act. I don't know if people know what the Jones Act is, but essentially it sort of places restrictions on having workers on foreign flagged vessels. And again, the vessels that we rely on in the offshore wind industry to date are foreign flagged. There is a single wind turbine installation vessel under construction in the U.S. That'll be the first. It's not done yet. And so you have to come up with creative feeder barge systems to move components to and from these vehicles without, going back to shore in the U.S., which is not allowed under the Jones Act. And so there's actually very interesting research and demonstration projects around things like that. Grid integration and getting to better points of interconnection and more seamless interconnection of offshore wind to a grid that really wasn't built to take offshore wind in the places where it's going to go near the coast. That's another place that we've been urging DOE to take action. And I should say that DOE recently awarded the New England states almost $400 million for this Power Up proposal to actually do a number of things, but this also includes new substations for offshore wind injection capacity that DOE will be funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law. So those are some of the things that we see as needs and addressing real pain points that we have today.
That's great. Maybe we'll talk about the blade, since everybody wants to talk about the broken blade. We recognize that the blade is not really a major issue from the environmental point of view. There's some cleanup, but compared to other things, it's really pretty small potatoes. But I do wonder, what does it mean for your development schedule for your project? And particularly, I think that the GE also has another blade break in UK, so it suggests that maybe something's wrong with the design, or I don't know.
Yeah, so again, I'm not trying to minimize the blade break, which is a real setback and really just unfortunate on a number of levels. As you alluded to, GE is the manufacturer of the wind turbines, including the blades that are being installed on Vineyard Wind. They are also deploying those same blades and turbines on a project in the UK called Dogger Bank, where they did have, in fact, 2 other blades break this summer. Those have gotten some attention here because of their connection to what happened at Vineyard Wind. In Europe, they've gotten very little attention from the public, which is just its own interesting contrast to how we react to incidents in the U.S. versus other parts of the world. Each of those, GE has provided some information publicly about the cause, and they are not actually connected. So there were, installation issues, an error basically in, lifting the blade in one case on Dogger Bank, and then But the issue at Vineyard Wind, GE has disclosed, is a manufacturing error. So there was insufficient bonding. The blades are, they're made of fiberglass, foam, and wood, very similar to boats, like extremely similar to boats. So again, it is unfortunate to have that debris in the ocean, but there's actually quite a lot of similar debris already in the ocean, which is not a good thing, but it is the reality of it. Every time, people do maintenance on boats and other things, there's a lot of similar debris that can occur. And so that's something that, we are still assessing the full ramifications of in terms of the manufacturing issue that has been identified. The safety regulator, federal safety regulator, is highly involved, and we're going through a process to re-review and inspect every single blade on the project. We don't have a certain timeline for when that will be complete, which means I don't have a certain timeline for when the project will be complete.
Oh, I hope you are.
I think it should be next year. I just don't know, I just don't know which month.
To what extent has local support for offshore wind and for the associated industry and jobs helped with the construction of Vineyard Wind? And during the Cape Wind era, the local opinion was like the opposite way, and it kind of caused a lot of trouble for that project. Can you talk about the public perception in the local community?
I think it's super important, and it's definitely not monolithic. There's a lot of different views out there, but it is really relevant, and it comes up, in terms of, a project. I'm thinking not just about Vineyard Wind, but as we're developing our next projects, can we get host community agreements where we need to land the cable? Can you get local permits? And the like. It is really important. It plays into the federal permitting process. And I think, our company actually really tries to pride ourselves on what we call a community first development approach. And we focus on purposeful partnerships. And so, when we brought forward our recent bid that went in New York about a week ago, we had over 100 letters of support from different organizations and communities and elected officials that were, supportive of the project. And that takes a lot of work. Typically where we'd seen, the opposition historically, there's some viewshed opposition, and that is still a thing. There is also concern from the fishing industry about impacts of offshore wind on restricting the areas at which they can do their work. I think it's really cool to point out, and not super well known, but we've actually hired a ton of fishing vessels on the Vineyard Wind project. They do things for us, in terms of servicing the project. They also help we have requirements under our federal permits to monitor for protected species, the North Atlantic right whale, but also others. And so we hire fishing vessels to be out there and be our eyes and ears for protected species. So there is economic opportunity for fishing industry in addition to mitigation payments that we also make available from the project. So that's, one version. There is and I want to address it, there's a lot of talk about whale impacts. That's something that increasingly comes up in the media. And I'll be pretty blunt about this. By and large, it's just fake news. That is just fake news. There has been a tremendous amount of purposeful disinformation that's being shared about whale impacts or whale deaths from offshore wind, none of which has been verified. It's been reviewed substantial. I mean, it's like every allegation has been reviewed by federal officials at NOAA, so the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Many independent researchers at universities have been, reviewing the evidence, and it's just not there. There's a couple different versions of the story that you hear. One is that the vessels are making too much noise and that's harming the whales. The other is just that, I don't know, something like the vessels are striking the whales or something like that, or that, as part of pile driving or something. And there's truly not much behind that. What there has been validation of is actually Brown University put out a study that's fascinating on this, tracing a lot of the whale stories, and I'm just going to say, tied it back pretty clearly as part of an investigative effort to fossil fuel funded industry efforts. And there is a very purposeful disinformation campaign on offshore wind in Wales. And I don't say that lightly. I'm not just making an idle allegation. You can go to the Brown University study. It's been written up in the Boston Globe and numerous other credible media outlets. There's an agenda here to sort of fight change, fight energy transition, fight progress. And one of the I don't think I would have imagined this or foreseen it a few years ago, but one of the tactics that they've really centered on is trying to highlight this potential impact to Wales.
Yeah, I have to say, I've learned multiple examples of dirty politics in clean energy. It's really a little disheartening, actually. But I guess we have dirty politics in a lot of things, so maybe it shows as part of the mainstream now. Will the power grid and transmission infrastructure be ready if you guys really do build 8 gigawatts? Is that a thing?
It's a thing, yeah. I would say there's a lot of work going into that, but we do have work to do. And I mentioned, for example, the Power Up proposal where, again, some utilities and others are trying to build new substation infrastructure. There are transmission projects in New York that have been green-lighted, both on Long Island and in New York City to harden transmission infrastructure specifically to allow for offshore wind. So those things are happening. They also take time, building a new substation, building new transmission on Long Island. That's not something that happens overnight. And so if those projects are significantly delayed for one reason or another, that definitely poses a risk to the delivery of the offshore wind power. Again, I think this is a larger issue for the renewables energy industry. Everybody, hears a lot of talk about transmission, for example, and the transmission needs. And we know that, FERC is taking on these issues. They've issued, significant orders on queue reform. Queue reform is an important aspect of this as well, making sure that, that there's realistic timelines for projects to be able to interconnect. So a lot's happening there. I'm not, if it doesn't go well, there is potential cause for concern. But, I'm heartened that I know, again, the federal government, the states are, putting resources to this to try and solve this challenge too.
Sure, go ahead.
Going to take 10 years, but a lot of researchers at MIT are looking into, better software to use the things more flexible ways, storage and so forth. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you're working on it, I guess is my comment. Because, yeah, absolutely.
There is a lot to squeeze, out of the existing grid.
Yeah, and exactly. If you can squeeze more out of the existing grid or make it more efficient, AI poses significant new opportunities to get better visibility, for example, on the electric grid that could help reduce some of the need for upgrades. All of that needs to happen, and again, I think would be squarely in that category you asked about before, like what should researchers be working on? What should DOE or other government funders like NYSERDA be funding? Again, we have such a challenge building infrastructure in this country. And again, offshore wind is one version of that, but we have many versions of it that I think the more we can utilize existing infrastructure, for sure, the better.
And maybe you can just talk about that. How is your company using AI and sensors and other modern tools to try to make your operation work better?
Yeah, so we're doing some small things, and I think we're, again, kind of monitoring the status of it. But for example, as part of our recent bid into Massachusetts, we partnered with the engine. I don't know how many people here are connected with the engine in some way, but obviously sponsored by by MIT, and originally, but also partnered with a couple of the companies that are funded by the engine that might have applicable technologies, and so we've made kind of commitments to work with them during the course of development of our project to see whether their technology be ready and available for our project. One is actually on a different topic is a company called Sublime Systems that's working on low carbon cement. And there is, again, cement and various components of our operations, and we've been working with them to see whether we'd be able to, again, try to reduce the overall carbon footprint, obviously, of our infrastructure by utilizing that technology. And other companies called Veer, who has essentially trying to make transmission lines more efficient as well. So those are not, we haven't got to the finish line on those things, but we're very open to that, and hopefully other developers are looking at those opportunities too, because we're going to have to try some of this out and get some advancement in real time as we look to build the industry.
Great. Maybe for a minute you can try to pretend that as of January 22nd or something, somebody in the administration calls you up and says, what policy should we put in? Do you have a suggestion? What you think?
If I had like just one thing, and it was a new federal administration, I think that's what you're asking. The pace of permitting for these projects, this has been kind of the challenge all the way back to Cape Wind, in fact, but it hasn't. We haven't gotten where we need to be, and so I would say better funding the permitting agencies that are doing work on these projects, as well as trying to streamline that process. Would be my single biggest ask. There's a lot of things that need maturity. Maybe another technology need. This isn't exactly that question, but just going back to that is I mentioned. How we have fishing vessels looking for protected species. We had an experience on Vineyard Wind last summer where there was significant fog, just unusually large amounts of fog, and then there was also the Canadian wildfires. That all significantly reduced visibility and inhibited our ability for those protected species observers to do their job and to identify any marine species that might be in the area, which actually stopped construction because we weren't able to meet the permit condition to do that. So we've been pressing in those conversations with federal permitting agencies better ability to rely on drones or other remote sensing technology, like other technology-based solutions that won't be defeated by fog or wildfires is the kind of thing that we've got to try and move our permitting processes and our environmental protection processes into the kind of more modern phase, I would say.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again for helping to move us all in the modern phase, and I'm looking forward to using your electrons.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Before you leave, I just wanted to announce our next speaker would be October 16th. It's a congressman whose name I forgot now, Sean Casten, and
cool.
From Illinois, who was previously in clean energy industry before he got elected to Congress.
Yeah.
He'll be coming talking. We'll have announcements about that. The following day, I think October 17th, if I had the date right, is the public on-campus discussion of our fusion report about the opportunities for fusion energy and what conditions have to be satisfied for fusion energy to really help decarbonize the electricity grid. And right now, I want to invite you all to come join us for some refreshments outside and some further chat with the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.